And welcome to the Napoleonicist and the first instalment of Irish Month. For the next 5 Wednesdays, the Napoleonicist is going weekly as we cover a topic that most British historians seem to love to quietly forget: Ireland's experiences and contribution to the Napoleonic Wars. Joining me today, I'm very excited to have Catriona Kennedy on the podcast, a senior lecturer at York University who has done some brilliant work. And I'll be honest here, I'm a bit of a fan. Her currently available publication is Narratives of War, Military and Civilian Experience in Britain and Ireland, but she's also working on a book entitled Only Echoes: Women, Politics and the Irish Nation in the Age of Revolution, which is coming out soon. Catriona, it's great to have you on. How have you been?
I'm good, Zach. Thank you so much for the very kind and generous introduction and for inviting me here to speak to you today. I'm always delighted to be able to talk more about Irish history to particularly a British audience, so you may have a wider audience beyond that.
Yeah, I think we're quite kind of closely knit, but there's a growing audience across the world, particularly in the States, but also in the Netherlands. I think Beatrice de Graaf is particularly kind of responsible for that. Let's start with the wider context, because I'm aware that a lot of our listeners probably won't be familiar with Ireland's history during this period, as I kind of alluded to in the introduction, because of the historiography and how it kind of pushes Ireland's experience to the fringe to a degree. So give us a sense of Ireland's relationship with Britain during the 1700s.
Okay, so well, technically Ireland is a separate and independent kingdom in this period. So it has its own parliament, but it shares a crown shares the monarch with Britain, and the monarch is represented in Ireland by the Lord Lieutenant. So it has an independent parliament, but actually in practice, it's very much subordinate to Britain. So Britain has the right to legislate for Ireland, and it also has the right to veto any legislation that's passed by the Irish Parliament. And of course, it should also be remembered that the Irish Parliament itself only represents a fraction of the Irish population. So it really only represents members of the Anglican Protestant Church, and excludes the Catholic majority. So that's about 70 to 75% of the population. And during the 18th century, a series of penal laws are passed that introduce various disabilities against Catholics in Ireland. So they're not allowed to own land, to vote, to bear arms, and so on. So political power is very much concentrated amongst that Protestant minority in Ireland. And for much of the 18th century, particularly in the earlier part of the century, they tend to think of themselves, the Irish Protestants, as British subjects in Ireland. So they have a strong sense of themselves as British settlers, and their primary identity lies with Britain rather than Ireland. But over the course of the 18th century, that begins to change, because of the sense of being a dependent kingdom who is at the mercy of Britain in various ways. And that particularly, those grievances kind of emerge around economic issues. So for instance, in 1699, there's the British Parliament introduces a Woolen Act that effectively prohibits exports of wool to anywhere from Ireland, and that really crushes the Irish woolen industry, which otherwise could have been quite a successful element of the Irish economy. So that is one of the first kind of flashpoints where an Irish patriot sentiment begins to crystallize, and there'll be various other flashpoints across the course of the 18th century where the Irish Protestants will begin to seek greater autonomy from Britain.
There are lots of questions that I'm keen to ask just off the back of what you've said there. I guess let's try chronologically first of all. The one that always really strikes me in terms of being a flashpoint, perhaps to create an embryonic resentment towards England particularly, is Cromwell and the Drogheda massacre. Is that something that at this point has become part of Irish folklore, or is it something that we've just kind of tried to join the dots between in terms of the story of Irish, I'm reluctant to say Irish nationalism, but certainly resentment towards Britain?
Yes, so certainly for Irish Catholics, that memory of the Cromwellian invasions of the mid-17th century and the suppression of the Catholic rebellions in Ireland will be a lingering source of resentment through the 18th century. At the same time, though, Irish Catholics are quite quiescent in the 18th century, or look like they're quite quiescent. You know, there is, if you compare Ireland and Scotland in this period, it's Scotland that's having the rebellions and they're part of the Union. So although there is a strong Jacobite sentiment amongst Catholics, so who are looking to restore the Stuart monarchy in Britain and Ireland, it doesn't really manifest itself in any acts of insurrection. But yes, that sense of grievance stretching back to the 17th century, and obviously it's during the 17th century that most Catholic land is transferred out of Catholic hands and into Protestant hands. So at the beginning of the 18th century, maybe only 15% of the territory of Ireland is in Catholic hands. And actually the penal laws will ensure that, by the mid-century, only 5% of of land in Ireland is owned by Catholics.
I mean, I'm listening to everything that you're saying, and I've always kind of wondered this about Britain and how it treats Ireland. Is it fair to say that Britain kind of acts like a colonial power in Ireland? When you think about how Britain acts in the wider empire in the 19th century, I don't know if I'm just kind of drawing tenuous parallels here, but there seems to be there's a lot of kind of commonality. Is this where we first tend to see Britain acting in this way towards, if you like, a conquered territory?
Yeah, I mean, if you, this is a kind of a question. It's a really good question. It's one that a lot of ink has been spilt over by Irish historians, and certainly, I think if you look to probably earlier periods in Irish history, in the 16th and 17th century, there is an argument to be made, and it has been made, that Ireland is a laboratory for the colonial project. So they'll test out, colonial strategies in Ireland first before applying those elsewhere. Particularly America would be seen as one place where they're applying the lessons learned from Ireland and from the plantation of English and Scottish settlers into Ireland in the 16th and 17th century. If we look to I suppose there's two issues to think about there, is that on the one hand are Irish Protestants, or that group of the descendants of those English and Scottish settlers. They are a colony, I suppose, in that sense, that they are colonial settlers. And is their attitude towards Irish Catholics evidence of a colonial mentality? So are they looking on them as a subordinate and savage race? Is there a racial component, I suppose, is one of the questions that has been asked. And that's quite tricky to make that case, because really the divide is religious here. And, the Irish Protestant ruling class accepts into its ranks Catholics who have converted to Protestantism. So there are very influential Protestants in the 18th century who are originally descended from Catholics. So on those grounds, you might say it's a religious divide rather than an ethnic or racial one. Then if we look at the relationship between Ireland and Britain and think, is that a colonial relationship, you know, at the level of the states? Most Irish Protestants in the 18th century would say, no, we're not a colony. Please stop treating us as one. So that's the kind of argument they're making to the British. You know, why are you treating us like a colony when we're British subjects here? We should enjoy, you know, we share the same monarch, or we want our equal rights that we should enjoy under the British Crown. But clearly there are colonial elements to it in terms of the dominance of the British state and the influence it exerts over the Irish Parliament, and through the Lord Lieutenant, you know, this representative of the British Crown who manipulates the Irish Parliament in various ways. But again, you might draw the parallel between America there. So there's a very similar trajectory in terms of the evolution of the American colonists' sense of themselves. So they start off, you know, asking for their rights as British subjects in the same way. But obviously by the time of the Revolution, they increasingly identify as Americans and, you know, are breaking away from the mother country. So there's a kind of similar trajectory that you might track in Ireland.
I really like that phrase that you used, laboratory for the British Empire.
It's not mine. I wish I'd coined it, but
I think I might call the episode that's actually that's possibly a little bit of a kind of a clickbait thing, but it's a great way of describing it. I kind of want to ask about nationalism and notions of Britishness, but I think we'll probably save that for a little bit later, because you were talking about religion, and clearly we have to talk about religion in quite some depth to at least partly understand the really deep divides and the tensions during this period. People hopefully know that kind of they've got Protestantism and Catholicism that have divided society for most of the 17th century. We see that in the English Civil War, Glorious Revolution. Has much really changed by the 1790s? Because it's worth bearing in mind for folks who don't know that the Catholic Emancipation Act is still decades away at this point.
Yeah, so things do begin to change towards the last quarter of the 18th century. You know, as I already said, there were a series of penal laws passed in the early decades of the 18th century that are really there to copper fasten Protestant power in Ireland. And it should be remembered as well that it's not just Catholics who suffer, so it's also Protestant dissenters who are not members of the Anglican Church. So they suffer less severe disabilities, but they're still, say, restricted from holding public office and so on. So that's a real source of grievance, particularly for the Ulster Scots Presbyterian community concentrated in the north of Ireland. So they also feel at odds with this Protestant ascendancy that's the dominant ruling elite. But in the last quarter of the century, there are a series of Catholic Relief Acts. So in 1778, 82 and 1793, and they do introduce some concessions. So Catholics are allowed to own land and longer leases. They're allowed to enlist in the British Army. And in 1793, they are given the vote, but they're not allowed to sit in Parliament. And the reason for that, for those concessions, is partly to do with British policy towards Ireland. So one of the things that they understand is that Irish Protestant patriots want greater independence, but they want Ireland to remain a Protestant nation. So that becomes a kind of weapon that the British can use against the Protestant patriots, at saying effectively, if you push for greater independence, we will emancipate the Catholics and you will become a minority within your own country. So that's a kind of, a constant threat that they can wield. And the other reason, of course, that the British are particularly keen to grant concessions to Catholics is because of military policy. So as you well know, Ireland, or Britain, is at war for much of the 18th century. Catholics are this untapped resource of military manpower, but up until 1778, they're not allowed to join the army, officially at least. So granting these concessions and allowing them to enlist really helps to kind of reinforce the British troops at this point. And of course they do join in their hundreds of thousands, and will go on to be a significant component of the British Army. So yes, that's the kind of context in which there's some gradual concessions being granted to Catholics in this period.
I'm really interested in what you said about how kind of Catholic emancipation is sort of used as almost a threat to hold over the Protestant minority. Is that an idle threat, in the sense that, is there any real will to do that? And if the Protestant kind of wing had called government's bluff, would the government ever have really gone through with that?
Well, yes, that's a good question, and we'll see it. I mean, in 1801, the problem is, would the George III have allowed full emancipation? And when Ireland is united with Britain in 1801, he puts his foot down, because actually one of the promises of the Act of Union was that Catholics would be granted full emancipation. But George III says that his coronation oath mandates him to protect the Protestant character of the state. So yeah, it's a good question whether, if Ireland was independent, nominally independent, whether he would have also seen that as his duty. And I think probably yes. And obviously would have been nervous. There would have been a nervousness about having a large Catholic majority state on the doorstep of Britain. And if you think about the uproar that accompanies Catholic relief in Britain in 1780, and the Gordon riots and other popular protests against those, yes, there clearly would have been a nervousness about pushing too hard on that door. Yeah.
Well, let's tap into that. I mean, in terms of the grassroots attitude in Britain, are events like the Gordon riots kind of representative of popular kind of attitudes towards the Irish, and particularly Irish Catholics, or is it sort of a minority who are vocal, and then a kind of a minority amongst the grassroots who are more acquiescent?
I think you could say, I mean, it's not even specifically Irish Catholics as such, but anti-Catholicism is such a core element of British and Irish, the Protestant psyche. If you think they're really nurtured on stories of Catholic atrocities, stretching back to, Fox's Book of Martyrs and Catholic persecution under Mary Tudor and so on. And then in Ireland, added to that are the stories of the Catholic atrocity literature around the 1641 rebellion, where there had been large massacres of Protestants, very much exaggerated in this literature, but that's really a staple of the Irish Protestant sort of reading in this period. So yes, that kind of image of Catholics as persecuting, savage, and so on is very much imprinted on the Protestant psyche. So there is that kind of broader anti-Catholic sentiment. Things are beginning to change a little bit, maybe more amongst the ruling elites from the, in the later part of the 18th century, partly because of a kind of spirit of enlightenment and religious toleration, also in part because Jacobitism as a political threat is no longer such an issue. So in 1766, James III, James Stuart, dies, and really Jacobitism at that point is finished. So there isn't the same anxiety about, I suppose, Catholicism as a political threat at that point.
I've got loads of questions that I could ask, but we should probably kind of keep the conversation moving forwards. Let's turn to the 1798 rebellion, because there's a long lead into that, isn't there? In part courtesy of the French Revolution.
Yes, and actually, I'd stretch back even further to the American Revolution. So it is within this broader. The 1798 rebellion happens within this broader age of revolution. But if we look at what happens during the American Revolution, is that Britain, of course, is engaged in the war with America. And in Ireland, units for home defence are established, which are ostensibly to defend Ireland in the event of invasion. But these volunteers, as they're known, go on to demand greater independence for Ireland. So they seize that opportunity, of a Britain that's distracted by the war with America and weakened by it, to push for greater concessions in conjunction with these patriot politicians in Parliament. And they have some success. So they do win economic concessions and some legislative concessions as well. But then that movement splits over the question of Catholic emancipation. Should they push for full Catholic emancipation, and also over political reform? Should they extend the franchise? Should they reform, the representation, boroughs, electing the Parliament? So it kind of goes into cold storage for much of the 1780s, and then the French Revolution happens, and that really reignites that movement that had for a brief period electrified Ireland. So you can see that that kind of longer roots for what happens in the 1790s, going back to this earlier movement. But the French Revolution's important for various reasons. Firstly, it's Protestants look on it as being very important in terms of how they think about Catholics. So it's a revolution happening in a Catholic country. And that really seems to break the perceived connection between Catholicism and ideas of despotism that, again, are one of these kind of enduring tropes in the Protestant psyche, is that, the continental monarchies are, the Catholic continental monarchies are absolutist, and the French are slaves, all that kind of rhetorics. But here they are seizing liberty for themselves. So that changes the way they begin to think about Catholics in Ireland. And secondly, it provides this new language, the rights of man, liberty, equality, fraternity, that offers a way of transcending those deep-seated religious divisions, those historical, long-standing historical grievances. Now there's a kind of language of natural rights that doesn't appeal to the past, doesn't appeal to religious identities, but is based on a sense of a common democratic humanity. So that's it, really kind of revitalizes a campaign for reform and independence. So the United Irishmen are founded in Belfast and Dublin in 1791, and much of their founding involves kind of celebrating the anniversary of the storm, the fall of the Bastille and so on. So they immediately identify themselves as supporters of the French Revolution. And they begin as an open constitutional movement. So they're campaigning for Catholic emancipation, parliamentary reform, and full male universal suffrage. So that's quite a radical, politically radical program at the time. So a lot of what they're doing in those early years is writing, publishing, trying to transmit this non-sectarian message. So that's, one of their real insights, is that as long as the Irish are divided by religion, Britain will always be able to play them off against each other. So, what Wolfe Tone, one of their leaders, says is that we must substitute the common name of Irishman for that of Catholic, Protestant and dissenters. So we must be united as Irishmen, not divided by our religious differences. So they're trying to get that message out, but of course that's very difficult in a way, persuading the popular classes that have for so long been divided to look at their Protestant or Catholic neighbour in a new light and to join together. So it really changes though once Britain enters the war against revolutionary France. And in that context, any kind of opposition becomes potentially treasonous. So the United Irishmen are banned in 1794 and are forced underground. So they'll reconfigure at that point into a mass, secretive, insurrectionary movement that is intent on rebellion. But that's not how they start out, but it's how they end up, largely because of this kind of broader wartime context.
And at the heart of all of this, as you mentioned already, is Theobald Wolfe Tone. Mm-hmm. What was Tone himself actually like as an individual?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Wolfe Tone is probably one of the more beguiling figures in Irish history. And obviously he's, one of the heroes of Irish nationalism, and widely considered to be the founding father of modern Irish republicanism. But I think one of the reasons he's so appealing is because he left these wonderful journals and memoirs. And whenever I'm teaching Wolfe Tone with my students, I always ask them if they think he appears like their stereotype of a revolutionary, and he really doesn't, because he's a much he's a very witty, fun, convivial person, and that really comes across in the journals, where he's willing to make fun of himself. He's he likes a drink, that his journals have extended sections on his hangovers and how he got them. So yeah, he's this very lively character. He's a teenager during the American War and during the kind of rise of the Irish volunteer movement, and he's absolutely entranced by that and by the military. So he plays truant from school, to go and watch the volunteer reviews in Dublin. And you know, it's at that point, you know, he traces his desire to be a soldier. So that's a kind of leading theme in Wolfe Tone's life, is that he was really a military adventurer. But his father stops him from joining the army. So he comes from a Protestant kind of middling class family. So when he's not able to go into the army, he goes on to Trinity College Dublin, where he's a kind of lazy but gifted student. And then after that, you have the sense of somebody who's intellectually ambitious, or, you know, he wants to make a name for himself, but is kind of looking for a cause. So he spends some time developing a proposal to establish a British military colony in the Sandwich Islands, so what's currently Hawaii, that he sends to the British government a couple of times, but is rebuffed. And some historians have suggested that it's that rejection by the British Empire, as it were, that turns him into a nationalist, that he's a colonial outsider who, because he's rejected by the mother country, ends up seeking his revenge, as it were, by throwing his lot in with Irish republicanism. So that's one possible interpretation. But he is one of the founding members of the United Irishmen, and his real skill is as a polemicist. He's a very gifted writer of political pamphlets. So a pamphlet he writes at the beginning of the 1790s, an argument on behalf of the Catholics of Ireland, which is writing in support of Catholic emancipation, trying to persuade those who are still reluctant to emancipate Catholics. It's one of the most widely circulated and read pamphlets in the 1790s in Ireland, along with Thomas Paine's The Rights of Man. Sorry, a cat has appeared.
You know what? I'm not even going to cut that. The cat can absolutely stay.
So apologies if you hear some meowing.
No, classic life of COVID issues right there. The cat has come to hog the camera.
Back in her place. Sorry. She's called Cleo after the muse of history, so maybe that was an opportune moment for her to make an appearance. But yeah, back to Tone. So he's kind of one of the chief writers for the United Irishmen, but when they're prescribed in 1794, he agrees to go into exile, firstly in the United States, which he hates, and he has no time for the Americans, but then he goes to France to try and negotiate French military assistance for an Irish rising. And it's at this point that he finally realizes his ambition of becoming a soldier. Because he's appointed a brigadier general in the army of General Osh, which is sent to Ireland with a very large invasion force in so about 25,000 French soldiers in 1796. So they're supposed to land off the coast of Cork in December 1796, but then there are terrible storms that stop them from landing. So it's a great what if moment in Irish history, because if they'd landed at that point, you know, when the authorities in Ireland just weren't really prepared for a rising or a French invasion, and this is a very substantial force, you know, things could have turned out very differently. But that's not successful. He returns to France and eventually joins a much smaller expedition that goes to Ireland after the rebellion has begun. But of course, this time they're expecting the French, and it's intercepted by a Royal Navy ship, and Tone is arrested, and he's court-martialed in his French uniform, of which he's incredibly proud. So he's wearing this blue uniform and asks at his trial, his one request is that he be allowed to, that he be killed as a soldier. So he asks that he be shot rather than being hung, drawn and quartered as a traitor, but they deny him that request. And he cuts his throat in prison and dies a pretty horrible death, but of course becomes a kind of nationalist martyr. So in some ways his importance in Irish history is as much about his death and his heroic reputation as it is about his actual actions.
This association with the French, is that, I mean, in many respects it kind of seems like a natural association because of the history between the British and the French, and the religious connection as well. Is that kind of more damaging for their cause in the longer term because of Britain being at war with France, and so therefore the cause of Irish independence kind of becomes associated with the nation's enemy, if you see where I'm going?
Yes, no, it is. It's an interesting question. And of course, it's much debated amongst the United Irishmen themselves. There's a significant group who are opposed to French intervention. As far as they're concerned, they'll just end up replacing British rule with a French dictatorship, you know, and they're looking at what's happening elsewhere in Europe and thinking they're not coming here to liberate us. This could turn out very badly. So there's a lot of debate in Ireland. There has been a connection, you know, that the idea of a French-supported invasion in support of a Jacobite rebellion is, you know, was a concern for much of the 18th century. And in fact, amongst the French Republicans, there's a lot of doubt really about whether the Irish are sufficiently Republican. You know, the French think they're too Catholic. You know, the French have kind of divested themselves of, you know, that the shackles of Catholicism, but you know, their concern is that at heart the Irish Catholics are royalists and enthralled to the church. And there's some good reason for that, because of course a lot of members of the French army in this period, or you know, in the pre-revolutionary French army, would have been of Irish extraction, and there were Irish brigades there. So, and some of those would have remained loyal to Louis XVI. So, you know, the French aren't too sure about what they're going to find when they go to Ireland, you know, and Tone has to do a lot of work trying to persuade them that, you know, that the Irish can be trusted. So whether involving a foreign power kind of escalates it, I suppose this is one of the, you know, it happens again in 1916 during the First World War, those efforts to try and involve the Germans. And of course that is quite damaging to the Irish cause. I think it's less so here because just Ireland was always going to be a defensive weak point for Britain, you know, and that's partly what motivates, of course, the Act of Union in 1801, is that effort to close off Ireland as a potential launch pad for a French invasion. Yeah.
Before we go any further, we should probably give people a quick sense of what actually happened during the 98 Rebellion.
Yeah, so I mean, in a way, what we're looking at in 1798, so it's really, the rebellion lasts from about May to September 1798. 98, but it's a series of quite separate and disconnected uprisings. So there's a rebellion that lasts about 2 weeks in the north of Ireland. At the very end, there'll be a French landing and a brief kind of rebellion in the west of Ireland that lasts about 6 weeks. But the fighting is mainly concentrated, or the place where the rebellion really takes hold is in the areas south of Dublin, Wicklow and Wexford, and there's some mobilisation in the counties to the north and west as well, but it, in some ways, what we think of as the 1798 rebellion is really the rebellion in Wexford. This was not the county where anyone would have expected I suppose the rising to be most intense. So obviously Dublin was originally intended to be the focal point of the rising. So they were going to capture the city and then spread outwards from there. But in the build-up to the rebellion, the United Irish leadership has really been decapitated. You know, it's been, not literally, but they had, you know, much of the leadership has been arrested. The United Irishman itself, they're riddled with spies and informers. So the government does have a pretty clear sense of their plans before the rising. They've also lost one of their key figures, Lord Edward Fitzgerald, who's a very interesting figure. Again, he comes from one of the leading aristocratic Anglo-Irish families in Ireland, fought with the British Army during the American War, which gives him key military experience that the other leaders don't have. But he's captured before the rebellion happens, and that really means that when it starts, they don't have much direction. Wexford, probably the rebellion happens there partly because they haven't been infiltrated in the same way the United Irish movement. You know, it's a secretive society, quite porous to informers, but you know, they haven't been infiltrated, but they're not as well organised probably as other parts of the country would have been. But the rebels there secure an early victory at Ullard Hill. So that kind of electrifies them. More people kind of come in to join as they see, you know, that they've managed to achieve some success. But there is quite a disconnect that starts to emerge between the largely Protestant and United Irish leadership. So they're schooled in, you know, the non-sectarian messaging of the United Irishmen, liberty, equality, fraternity. They established the Wexford Republic, you know, and are trying to manage what's happening in that region. And then the rebel rank and file, many of whom haven't really fully assimilated United Irish propaganda. You know, they're not, you know, they haven't, you know, really adopted the language of the democratic rights of man. And it does start to spiral out of control into sectarian atrocities. There's a massacre of Protestants in a barn at School of Bogue where they're burned alive. There's another massacre of Protestant prisoners on Wexford Bridge. So absolutely that sense that the rebellion is no longer really at that point a United Irish rebellion. It's a kind of all this sectarian resentment that is bubbling up to the surface and emerging in really explosive and quite savage ways.
So going back to what you were saying about how the United Irishmen had been infiltrated, particularly in Dublin, with that level of information that is going to the authorities, how is the uprising able to sort of flare up so quickly? Is it just quite simply that there isn't enough information on what's going on in Wexford, or is there kind of a degree of complacency amongst the English that, well, we've got the situation in Dublin in hand, so therefore everything else is going to fall into place?
Yes, probably. They know that once, so they were aware of what the plans were for the rebellion in Dublin. So basically they sent troops to all the points where the rebels were supposed to be assembling. So although there is a kind of rising, when they see that they've been foiled, the rebels quite quickly and quietly will return home. And there isn't, some have suggested that they never, there was a meeting of the United Irish Directory where the delegate who was sent from Wexford got drunk on his way to the meeting and never turned up. And of course, that's where the arrests are made, so that they have the details of the membership for the various counties, but they don't have the Wexford membership list, so they aren't able to, infiltrate or kind of, capture and identify the key figures there. Yeah, so I think the Wexford would not have been necessarily thought of as a prime site for rebellion or a key strategic point either, so I think that's probably it, that, they were just less focused on that region.
So how do the Brits go about kind of re-establishing control?
Well, I suppose the one thing that's interesting to note about how the rebellion itself is actually defeated is that it's largely done with Irish troops. So as in Britain in this period, there are home defence units raised. So there's an Irish militia, and that's the rank and file of the militia is largely Catholic. And then from 1796, another body is raised, the Irish Yeomanry, which is more Protestant in its composition. And that's seen as being, in some ways, a more sectarian body, the armed wing of the Protestant ascendancy. But those Catholic soldiers in the Irish militia will actually fight well and kind of loyally, as it were, against the rebels. So they're often sent from different counties of Ireland to Wexford and elsewhere. So a lot of, I suppose that's one of the paradoxes or apparent paradoxes, is that it is often Irish soldiers who are at the forefront of defeating the rebellion, and they do that with reinforcements as well from particularly fencible regiments who are sent from Britain. So basically, I mean, it doesn't, as I said, although there's kind of continuing I guess guerrilla warfare that really goes on until maybe 1803, most of the main areas of rebellion are quite quickly quashed.
Yeah. I mean, there is an obvious question here, but perhaps you've kind of answered it already within that about the French, because strategically, this was an obvious opportunity to cripple Britain. We've talked already about the efforts in 1796 to land a force and that not coming off because it's ostensibly because of the weather. So why aren't they able to capitalize on this? Is it a lack of forewarning? Is it a lack of willingness? Is it just that the whole thing is kind of mopped up in such a short space of time that the French don't have time to react? What's the reasoning behind it all?
Well, the easy answer, the quick answer is Napoleon. So basically, the problem is, although there was interest, clearly in 1796 in the French Republic in launching a kind of dual invasion of Britain and Ireland. By 1798, that commitment is really fading because Napoleon is so focused on the Mediterranean and Egypt. So that's where his attention has been drawn, and Ireland has kind of fallen off the French radar.
So essentially what he draws what would have been the troops available for an invasion of Ireland.
Yeah, so even though they're sending these smaller groups, but they only send about 1,000 troops to the west of Ireland, and they're quite successful. They do defeat the government forces at Castlebar, and they do manage to penetrate quite deeply into the heart of Ireland. But which just makes you think, what could they have done with a bigger force, if they'd had 20,000 and a better force as well. If Napoleon himself had come, things could have been very different.
Absolutely. The great fear of Britain if Napoleon lands, although admittedly that fear kind of comes to its zenith much later. What happens to that French force in the end?
The General Humberts, is it? Yeah. Well, they're actually treated. I mean, this really points to the differences between how the government forces think of the French and the rebels. So the French prisoners are, the French soldiers are taken prisoner. They're treated quite well. I think they're sent to taken as prisoners of war. The rebels who joined them when they landed are massacred. So there's a real sense that the brutality of the kind of the prosecution of the campaign in Ireland is striking. It's seen as being outside the conventions of honourable warfare. So having read quite a lot of memoirs by soldiers who fought in Ireland and elsewhere in Europe during the revolutionary Napoleonic period, it is really striking that they talk frankly about committing atrocities in Ireland in a way that they wouldn't do for the Peninsular Campaign or any other campaign.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a whole literature there with Gavin Daly and so on, isn't there, about what people will and won't admit to. I'm half tempted to go down that route as well, but I know I'm always talking about discipline with my guests, so I will resist that urge this time. What changes in the wake of the uprising? Because it's kind of a gross understatement to say that the English are pretty unhappy with what's happened.
Yes, so I mean, obviously this has been a very expensive, a very costly distraction at a time of war. So I suppose the most immediate response is that, they introduce, as the rebellion is still kind of happening, they begin preparing proposals for an act of union between Britain and Ireland. And that's been, on the cards for quite a long time. But this is really seen as the moment to introduce it. And, as we were already discussing, to kind of once and for all sort of address the weakness, the vulnerability that Ireland creates for British defences. But of course, the Union itself is dressed up in all sorts of emollient language about how this will civilise Ireland. I mean, it's not that emollient, it's quite offensive, of course, to many Irish people, but that it will allow Ireland to enjoy greater commercial prosperity, all the benefits of the Union and the Empire, and so on. But the British government has to, as they did in Scotland in 1707, they can only get it through Parliament by bribing Irish parliamentarians who are a pretty corrupt and unscrupulous bunch. But, they will, on the second attempt, they will vote themselves out of existence.
So the Act of Union, is it intended as a punishment but kind of window dressed as beneficial, or is it simply a case of they keep kind of having this thought about whether or not it's a good time, and that the rebellion just shows, look, you've got to do something?
Well, for a lot of people, I suppose you have to remember that for a lot of people, including, you know, United Irishmen, the Irish Parliament, the loss of the Irish Parliament is nothing to lament, because they see it as the bastion of the Protestant ascendancy, and it becomes increasingly so in the 1790s. So actually it's a corrupt Parliament, it's unrepresentative, it's blocked Catholic emancipation. So a lot of the United Irishmen are fairly, you know, blasé about the passage of the Act of Union. Catholics, they win Catholic support for the Union by making a tacit promise that it will be accompanied by full Catholic emancipation. And as you know, I already mentioned, of course, George III puts his foot down on that score, and William Pitt will resign over that because, you know, in some ways, even though, you know, Catholics weren't necessarily involved, it was premised on the promise that they would be emancipated, and of course, you know, that they would be less of a threat within a United Kingdom than they had been as the majority population in Ireland. So yeah, I mean, I think that although there are a lot of the people who are most opposed to the Union are sort of these not, you know, these kind of bigoted members of the Protestant ascendancy who don't want to see their power lost, but, you know, they're not necessarily, there's not a lot of tears shed by other sections of the Irish population.
I want to kind of finish this by dwelling for a moment on Britishness, and we've used the word British a fair bit during this discussion. Linda Coley has fairly famously argued that kind of the Napoleonic Wars represented a crucial period for the formation of what it meant to be British, and she goes so far as to say that effectively being British almost sort of meant just not being French, however you wanted to define that. The Irish Rebellion seems to suggest, to me at least, that Britain and Ireland were a very, very long way from being united by a set of common principles. So how do we reconcile the two? Does just a lot change during the conflict, in your opinion, or do we not just reconcile the two? Is this just a flaw in Coley's argument?
Yes, and I can understand why Linda Coley didn't want to take on Ireland or the problem of Ireland when she was writing Britons. And she kind of very, you know, at the beginning of that book, you know, says Ireland's Catholicism really rules it out from the integrative processes that make up Britishness, because Protestantism is the key binding agent, or one of the key binding agents. So she kind of brackets Ireland off to focus on Scotland, England and Wales. But of course, you know, as we've already noted, Ireland is engaged in a lot of the integrative experiences that Coley highlights, like the experience of you know, enlisting in the army during the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. So, you know, we're looking at 150,000 at least Irish soldiers who fight with the British forces in this period. You know, you'll know this well, but, you know, they're considered to be absolutely instrumental in victories like Waterloo. So there is a possibility there to build a unionist Irish identity off the back of the successes of Irish soldiers in the British Army during that period, but that doesn't really seem to take off. But, you know, I think we can't discount that would have been a possibility in the early years after the Union. And the problem, I think, for unionism in Ireland, or any sense of Britishness, is really that failure to grant Catholic emancipation. If it had been granted in 1801, or, you know, shortly thereafter, the Irish Catholic population may well have been reconciled to the British state. I don't think you can rule that out. But as it is, there's a long, several decades of campaigning for Catholic emancipation led by Daniel O'Connell. And one of the interesting things looking at the history of Irish nationalism from the 18th to the 19th century is, as we've talked about, Irish nationalism in a way in the 18th century is largely a Protestant phenomenon. It's led by Protestants. The United Irish leadership is largely Protestant. But then going into the 19th century, it will re-emerge as a Catholic, a predominantly Catholic phenomenon. And that's in part because of, that sense of estrangement from the Union that comes from not having emancipation granted at the beginning. So yeah, you could look though again, I suppose, at actually what happens in Ulster. I mean, that's really interesting. And, it is important to remember that Ulster in the 1790s is considered the most Republican part of Ireland. They're really at the vanguard of Republican separatism, and the founders of the United Irishmen are Ulster Presbyterians in Belfast. So what happens to them? So that part of the country does end up, the descendants of those United Irishmen, many of them a century later are going to be unionists. They're going to be opposed to Home Rule for Ireland. And yes, I suppose you could argue that's because they increasingly, the differences between the Protestants diminish after 1800, so that they feel more of a sense of affinity with Anglicans than, with the Irish Catholics. But, I suppose it does go to show the very different trajectories for those different communities in Ireland under the Union.
Does it help the Unionist cause that they're able to emphasise, to what extent they're willing to emphasise, this is another thing, but they're able to emphasise that the British victories that are secured over the course of the Napoleonic Wars, most famously under Wellington, are the result of troops of all four nations of the Union? Because that's something that you see being pushed quite a lot in the contemporary publications, whether it be caricatures or newspapers. Is that something that is able to trickle down at a grassroots level, or is that just kind of the message that people want to push, that it just isn't kind of accepted more broadly?
Yes, I think this is a really interesting question, and it's one that I'm always hoping someone will explore in more detail, because there's been a lot written, of course, about the, the way in which the contribution of Scottish troops is to the British Army really becomes an intrinsic part of Scottish unionism and the image of the Highland soldier as kind of enjoying a distinctive identity, but that's also very British. And of course, the question is, why doesn't that quite happen for Irish soldiers in the same way? And there is a kind of a popular tradition of, or in print culture, there's lots of novels that celebrate the Irish soldier, there's songs, so it is very much, but the image of the kind of comical Irish soldier is very much there. They write a lot of memoirs about their experiences in the army, but it's not really capitalized on. I mean, the military, the memory of military heroism in the Napoleonic Wars is largely a Protestant phenomenon. And of course, the memory that really gains traction and really exerts a powerful hold in Ireland for much of the 19th century will be of the 1798 rebellion. So it's the one that's sung up in ballads that will become, especially a century later in 1898, it will become the memory of 1798 will become key to rallying the nationalist movement going into the kind of later 1916 to the War of Independence phase of Irish nationalism. So yeah, I mean, so there's two memories there really that offer very different versions of Irishness, one of which, the memory of service in the British Army could have formed the foundation for a unionist identity. But of course, the memory of the 1798 rebellion, is very much a kind of national separatist identity.
Catriona, this has been absolutely brilliant. I always love interviewing people, but this is definitely up there amongst my highlights. Thank you very much for joining me. But before you go, remind people of your book and where they can get hold of it.
So the book that's out is the very boringly titled Narratives of War, Military and Civilian Experience in Britain and Ireland, 1793 to 1815. So do please, if you can find cheap copies of it, it is of course a horribly overpriced academic text. But thank you very much for having me, Zach. I really enjoyed that. I haven't been teaching this year, so it's kind of nice to be able to talk about my subject that I usually teach as a special subject with you.
And when's the book that you're working on due out?
Well, hopefully next year, but all those details need to be confirmed. So yeah.
When it's done, let me know, and we'll see about interviewing you again.
Great, thank you, Zach.
That was Catriona Kennedy joining me to discuss the Irish Rebellion of 1798. And as you heard, you can order Catriona's excellent books online now. That kicks off the first instalment of Irish Month, and the fun continues every week here on the Napoleonicist for the rest of March. I'll be joined by Jim Deary to discuss the Irish troops in Wellington's army, Marcus Beresford to talk about William Carl Beresford, the Marshal, and Andrew Dorman to talk about British troops in Ireland. I'm also doing a Voices from Ireland series, inspired by the success of the Voices from the Battlefield thing that I did for the anniversary of Waterloo. The idea is that people pick an extract written by an Irish soldier or civilian, record it and send it in, perhaps preceded by a few words on why you picked that particular one, and they'll be released later in the month. If you're interested in getting involved, drop me a line on Twitter at ZWhiteHistory. A big thank you to my patrons who continue to support me on Patreon to make this podcast possible. Please check out the link in the description if you're interested in supporting the show. There's an exciting new perk of 10% off Napoleonic books from a prominent publisher. Particular thanks go to my mentioned in Dispatches patrons, Rob Griffith, Alexandra Churchill, an anonymous Canadian, Lynn Dawson, John Haynes, Anna Vakulenko, Jamie Kingston, Beatrice de Graaf, Rory Muir, Brendan Teeling, James Bevan and Lucy Tatner. If you're watching on YouTube, remember to hit that subscribe button below. Yes, podcasters, you can watch the whole interview on YouTube. Just search for The Napoleonicist. And if you're watching these and want to explore the whole Napoleonicist series, all back episodes of the podcast are available on pretty much any podcasting platform. Please keep spreading the word on social media. The likes, shares, retweets and comments all help, as do the reviews. And remember that the discussion is always going on in the forum at thenapoleonicwars.net. Until next time, I'm Zach White. This has been The Napoleonicist. Take care of yourselves, my friends. Stay well, stay safe, and as always, thank you for listening.